Welcome to the Full Nielsen. Today I'm going to be comparing a couple of different sets of ratcheting wrenches. Over here I have a set of GearWrench 120 XPs, and on this side over here I have a set of the Milwaukee ratcheting wrenches. Now the first difference you're going to see between these two sets of wrenches is the way these wrenches are stored, or the wrench keepers that they come with. Milwaukee gives you a tray that fits really well in a tool cart or a toolbox or tool chest, and GearWrench gives you this little keeper that has this little fold down thing, so if you wanted to throw them in a bag or you need to be mobile, you can throw them in something like that and keep them organized. Obviously that's not going to work very well with the Milwaukees, because if you throw them in a bag, there's nothing holding these in these trays. They're just going to go flying all over the place. So if you need to put them in a bag or need mobility, that might be a factor for you. You might like the keeper design on the GearWrench better. For me, I'm putting all of these in a tool cart, and I much prefer the design of the Milwaukee. The SAE set that they have made fits this perfectly. It goes from biggest to smallest, and the two sets fit together so that there's no wasted space in your drawer. GearWrench, obviously it's not going to work that same way, but anyway, so that's some of my observations with the way these two companies go about keeping the wrenches. I prefer the Milwaukee design. Now, length is the next thing I want to show you guys. The lengths of these wrenches are quite a bit different. As you can see, the GearWrench looks like a long pattern design. I don't know if they're advertising it that way, but it is significantly longer than the Milwaukee. I prefer the extra length that the GearWrench offers over the shorter length of the Milwaukee. Some people might say, well, I'm working in really tight spaces or whatever. I've never found that to be an issue. I've never found a situation where with a wrench like this, having an extra inch made it to where the wrench couldn't be used versus, you know, a shorter wrench. Generally, if I'm in a real tight space like that, I'm not using wrenches. I've got socket sets with stubby ratchets and things like that to get into some of those really weird, awkward spaces. So length, there's a difference. The GearWrenches are significantly longer. I prefer that. The finish, the Milwaukees have like a black chrome type finish. I don't know how well this is going to show up in camera because lighting or whatever, but anyway, they have a black chrome finish, and it's a beautiful finish. I really prefer this finish over the GearWrench. I think when they get greasy and dirty, or your fingerprints or whatever, none of that stuff seems to show up quite as bad as just the regular chrome on the GearWrenches. So I prefer the finish on the Milwaukees, but that's just personal preference. If you like normal chrome, you might prefer the GearWrench. Now, comfort. The Milwaukees have what they're advertising as like a twin I-beam design, so they machine this center section down here relatively narrow, and then up here it's beefed up, and it's very nicely contoured. It's nice and round, feels super comfortable in your hand. You could put a tremendous amount of pressure on this and it's not going to bother your hand. Now the GearWrenches, on the other hand, have kind of a strange design. So what they've done here, you can see this mark in here, they have machined this section of the wrench to where it is very, very thin. You can see that from the top, that this actually tapers. So it's very thin on the box end of the wrench, and then it gets wider towards the open end of the wrench. I suspect they did that because they're probably assuming that if you're really going to put some torque on something, you're going to be using the box end of the wrench, and so your hand is going to be on this other end of the wrench, and so they tried to beef that up or make that a little thicker so it would be more comfortable in your hand. I prefer what Milwaukee has done. I will say though that the drawback of the Milwaukee is I think it is significantly heavier than the GearWrench. Now, wrench to wrench, obviously with the extra length that might not be the case, but this wrench probably feels like if I grab a 22 millimeter, I would bet that this Milwaukee, in spite of the extra length, is a heavier wrench than the GearWrench. So if that is important to you, to have a wrench that's a little bit lighter weight or whatever, the GearWrenches, for their length, I think are even lighter than the Milwaukees, or maybe close to the same weight. So that's the drawback of this beefier design, as while it's more comfortable, it's also a little bit heavier. But for me personally, I prefer the way that the Milwaukees are contoured over the GearWrenches. I think they're more comfortable. Now the open end of the wrenches, the Milwaukees have, I can't remember their exact name for this open end. They're not the ones that invented this. I couldn't even tell you what company did for sure. There's a few of them on the market right now. I can't remember if Crescent Wrench or somebody's now making an open end like this. Carlisle's making an open end like this. There's a bunch of companies that have jumped on the bandwagon at doing that. I don't know who originally came up with that design, but I suspect what's happened is that a patent somewhere has expired, and now everybody and their dog is making an open end wrench like this. With good reason. The open end of these Milwaukees is one of the best designs I've seen. It's just not going to let go of a fastener. And it's going to take an incredible amount of pressure to destroy a fastener before you're going to round it or have any problem that way. So I think this is an excellent design for the open end of the wrench. As you can see, it's got little teeth that grab onto the fastener and keep it from slipping. I'm not sure if you can see that real good. You can see those teeth in there. And then you can also see this V-groove in here that fits the fastener. So once those teeth bite on there, it's not going to let that fastener slip out of the open end of the wrench. And so these other surfaces here actually are contributing something simply because the fastener can't back out because of the design of those teeth. Anyway, great design for the open end of the wrench on the Milwaukees. GearWrench is using what they call Surface Drive Plus. It does not have teeth, but it is also not totally flat. I don't know if you can see that very well, but they've got this interesting contour in there. Let's see. Yeah, you can kind of see that. Anyway, they've got this interesting contour in there that they call Surface Drive Plus. I've watched a lot of tests on different wrenches, and I did quite a bit of research before I bought either of these sets, and the Milwaukee absolutely obliterates the Surface Drive Plus in terms of the open end and how much traction you get before you round off a fastener. Now, to be fair, I have noticed that some people have done testing to see how much torque you can put on the head of a bolt before you either strip the threads on the bolt, snap the head off of a bolt, stuff like that. And I suspect that either one of these wrenches are probably going to get enough of a purchase on most of the hardware that you're working on your vehicles and stuff like that, to where the fastener is probably going to be the weakness, not the open end of the wrench slipping. But if you need one that that's going to give you the best purchase, the Milwaukees are going to give you a better grip on the open end with the open end of the wrench on a fastener than what the GearWrench is going to provide you with. Now for the box end of these wrenches, which is probably why most people are buying ratcheting wrenches, the Milwaukees have a 12-point box end, and that's pretty much the standard for ratcheting wrenches, while the GearWrenches have a spline drive. Now, for me, if you happen to be working on vehicles that have a lot of 12-point fasteners, you're probably going to prefer a 12-point wrench. It just makes sense, just like you're going to want 12-point sockets and all that kind of stuff. I think for most of us, we're probably working on vehicles that have a lot of 6-point fasteners. And so I always buy 6-point sockets because I don't want them slipping. I've rounded off 6-point fasteners using 12-point sockets. And neither one of these are going to be the best choice. If you need to put a lot of torque on something and it's a 6-point fastener, get a 6-point socket and go about it that way, as opposed to using a 12-point or spline drive where you're probably going to be more likely to round the fastener. But as far as using a spline drive versus a 12-point on 6-point fasteners, in my experience, it's probably a toss-up. I don't think one is necessarily going to be way more likely than the other to round off the fastener. I don't think either one of them are the best choice for a really high torque application. So as far as that design, I'd say it's a toss-up. Now when it comes to, keep wanting to mix these wrenches up. I want to grab one that's the same size so I can show you this. When it comes to the amount of material on the ratcheting end, you can see that the Milwaukee is substantially thicker. And if you've ever tried to use a ratcheting wrench in a really tight space, I've had places that were tight enough that you can't use the box end of a ratcheting wrench, but you can use the box end of a standard wrench because the ratcheting portion is thick enough that it won't allow you to fit the box end over a fastener. In my opinion, that's where I'm going to prefer the thinner design of the GearWrench, because it's going to allow me to get into a little bit tighter spaces. Now, as far as the feel of the ratcheting portion of each of these wrenches, both of these wrenches have a dual pawl design, which means that they have these little pawls in there that engage this little mechanism, or the actual spline drive portion of this has little teeth machined in the back of the inside of this mechanism. And down in here you've got two pawls. They've got teeth on them, and what they do in order to achieve a lower swing arc is they stagger the pawls like this, and they've got springs, and they're basically doing this inside of there, engaging with, well, the shape of them would be a little different, but you get the idea. They're engaging with the teeth that are machined into the back portion of this spline drive on this wrench. And that's how they're able to achieve, essentially, there might be 60 teeth ground into the back of this, but with dual pawls, it allows you to double the amount of clicks that you're getting out of your wrench, and essentially cut the swing arc, assuming that the pawls are stacked perfectly, you know, split 50-50 and not close to each other or anything like that. It's going to cut the swing arc in half. Well, that's what both of these wrenches have, that same type of a design. Went off on a little bit of a scientific tangent there. Anyway, so as far as that's concerned, they're the same. The reason why companies do that instead of just machining finer teeth marks into this and keeping one single pawl is because it is a stronger design. If you machine too many teeth into the back of this spline drive and you just had a single pawl, though you're machining those teeth to where they're thinner and thinner, and then if you really put a lot of torque on them, you'd be more likely to actually break the teeth. I don't know how big of a deal that is, but it seems like most companies are going with dual pawls to avoid any problems that way. Now, as far as the actual feel of them, and I know this is a big deal to a lot of people, I read quite a bit about it, and I have found can be a big deal depending on what you're working on, is the amount of backlash, is what they call it. So what that means is if I put this on a fastener and I go to ratchet the wrench back like this to then twist the fastener, how much tension does it take how much pressure does it take to activate the ratcheting mechanism in your wrench? Well, I can tell you between these two sets of wrenches, the GearWrench probably takes, like, if I had a way to measure it, I bet it's less than 50% the amount of pressure to actually make the ratcheting mechanism action work when compared with the Milwaukees. The Milwaukees, the way they came, were like incredibly stiff. I know some of you are going to say lubricate them. I did. I've lubricated, and I have not lubricated these set of GearWrenches yet, but I have lubricated these Milwaukees. I worked them over quite a bit. I even took a rag and shoved that rag through the ratcheting end after I lubricated them and chucked it in a drill and spun these ends to loosen them up, because they were so stiff that if you put them on a fastener and went to ratchet, it's very likely it would just turn the fastener instead of activating the ratcheting portion of the wrench. So the GearWrenches, and that's something I have not seen anybody else really talk about, are way better than the Milwaukees when it comes to the amount of backlash. Now, as far as like how fine or what the swing arc's like, the Milwaukees are supposed to have a lower swing arc than what the GearWrenches have. Very slightly. These have 120 clicks, which is why they have the 120 XP designation. The Milwaukees are 140. But to me, that doesn't matter as much as what's the backlash like and how smooth are they to operate and stuff like that. And GearWrench is just far superior to the Milwaukees. Another thing that I have noticed is with these Milwaukees, I'm not sure if I can show you this. I actually tried to get a hold of Milwaukee about this and they never responded. So I guess that's their problem. Maybe I'll send them a copy of the video. But I can push this center. You see how much that slides? I can take the center of that wrench and I can push that out a significant amount. I'm going to call it deflection for the sake of this video, but there is a significant amount of deflection in the box end of this wrench in terms of this mechanism not being held in the same way that something like the GearWrench is. GearWrench, I can put tons of pressure on it, it doesn't hardly budge. All ratcheting wrenches have a teeny amount of play, but not like these Milwaukees. I don't know why that's that way, but it is super irritating. And you can see how if you don't have a lot of fastener to get on, I mean, that's a pretty significant amount of movement. But if you don't have a lot of fastener to get a purchase on in the first place, and you're taking this wrench and shoving this end on, and it's pushing that insert slightly out of alignment, that just irritates me. But anyway, it is what it is. You guys might not think it's a big deal, but that's one of my observations between some of the differences of these. Now, which ones do I recommend? Well, if you need like a really stout open end of a wrench that you never want to slip, go with the Milwaukees. If you're not worried about that and you have never really had any issues that way and you think, well, I've never had any issues with just a standard flat end of a wrench, the Surface Drive Plus is going to be better than that, and that will probably be good enough. The issue that I've got is I already have a set of the regular Milwaukees that are the non-ratcheting. So I already have those open ends. So I'm buying these like 99% for the box end of the wrench. And the GearWrenches are better in that regard, in my opinion, in pretty much every way you slice it. They're thinner, there's less backlash, they're smoother to operate, it's a longer wrench. So for me personally, I prefer the GearWrench 120 XPs over the Milwaukees. I've used the Milwaukees more than the 120 XP so far. That's just because I haven't had these as long, but I will probably be getting rid of my set of Milwaukees because I just prefer these GearWrenches. I think both sets are great sets of wrenches and they offer great value for the price point that they come to market at, depending on if you can find decent sales and stuff like that. I paid $300 for my set of Milwaukee, and I got for the metric and the SAE set. Another one of the differences that I forgot to mention is that the Milwaukee set goes up to 22 millimeter, while the GearWrench 120 XP set, at least this particular set, goes from 8 to 22 millimeter, and then it jumps to 24. So you get a 24 millimeter wrench with the GearWrenches that you don't get with the Milwaukees. But anyway, those are some of my observations of the differences and some of the pros and cons of each. I hope this helps any of you guys out there that might be in the market and might be considering either of these two brands of wrenches or these sets of wrenches. Thanks for watching the video. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave those in the comment section below. Have a nice day.